we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm so excited to have Stuart here. So let me introduce him. So let's welcome Stuart Russell. He wears so many hats. He's the Smith-Zadeh Chair in Engineering at UC Berkeley, where he's a computer science professor. Unfortunately, well, I guess we're almost the same age, so I couldn't have had you when I was at UC Berkeley. But if I had Stuart, I probably would have majored in computer science, because one of the first books I read was actually Stuart's book. He co-authored the main textbook in artificial intelligence called AI, A Modern Approach. And that was just a wonderful book. He's also the head of the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence at UC Berkeley. And he has recently written a book called Human Compatible AI and the Problem of Control. And students, you'll be excited to learn that I was just at the Amazon webpage, and I don't know if you know this, Stuart, Kindle's selling the book for $4.99.
I did not know that.
Good for students, so they can grab it before. I mean, that's probably a mistake.
Sounds like it. I shall talk to my publisher about that.
Right. And the book was extremely well received, and I really enjoyed reading it. Let me just read a few quotations before we start. So, for example, Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize, writes, "This is the most important book I have read in quite some time. It lucidly explains how the coming age of artificial superintelligence threatens human control. Crucially, it also introduces a novel solution and a reason for hope." And Max Tegmark writes, "A must-read. This intellectual tour de force by one of AI's true pioneers not only explains the risks of ever more powerful AI in a captivating and persuasive way, but also proposes a concrete and promising solution." So I'm very excited to introduce you, Stuart. So let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, for inviting me. Looking forward to today and vigorous discussion. So I'm going to try to give a short talk and then leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So as Susan mentioned, I just published this book. And it's the result of about 6 years of research that I did starting when I was on sabbatical in Paris, about what I think the future could be like if we do things right. So let me actually begin a lot earlier. This is, as you probably know, Alan Turing. And I just read today that he's going to appear on the 50-pound note in the United Kingdom. So it's very exciting. Alan Turing is the founder of computer science, and also in many ways a founder of artificial intelligence. In 1950, he wrote a very influential paper, Computing Machinery in the Mind, which talks about artificial intelligence as a possible area of study that was made feasible by the invention of computers by Turing and by others during World War II. And he talks about machine learning as the most promising method for creating artificial intelligence. He talks a lot about various philosophical objections to the possibility of AI existing. He proposes a test, which we now call the Turing test. But what fewer people know is that in 1951, he gave a speech on the radio talking about what would happen if AI actually succeeded. And he said, and I'll try to do the accent, "It seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control." So he offers no apology, no mitigation, no solution. There's really a sense of resignation here. This is just a factual prediction about the future. But for some reason, partly because this was never actually published, we have his typescript, the notes that he prepared for the radio lecture, but it was never published. And of course, AI turned out to be much more difficult than people expected. So very little attention was paid to the question of what happens if we succeed in AI. But this is a marker saying this is at least what Turing thought would happen if we succeeded in AI. So if we fast forward to today, we have a lot of the long-term dreams of AI coming true. The self-driving car was a long-term dream of John McCarthy, one of the founders of AI in the 1950s. I think around 1970, John said that one of the dreams for his AI lab was to have a car that could take him from Palo Alto to San Francisco Airport. And that dream is now very close to coming true. In fact, you could do it right now, just not with a commercially available product. We've seen programs learn to play Go to a level that allows them to beat all human beings, and in many ways leave humans in the dust as far as playing games like Go and chess are concerned. We're also seeing some of the downsides of success already. This is a rhetorical question asked by Forbes. So bias is ever present in applications of AI that use any kind of human-generated data. We're also seeing the sort of combination of AI algorithms that recommend content and an industry of humans who generate false content, really affecting our society, our democracy, and just what version of reality people live in. We are seeing impersonation of human beings, and I think this is going to be a much more serious problem in future. So when you look at these photographs of people, it's interesting to try to figure out which of them are actually real human beings. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Maybe you can put your guesses in the chat window as to which one of these 4 individuals is a real human being and which one is not. And I'll tell you in a second. There are ways of using AI to kill people. The official term for that is lethal autonomous weapons systems, but killer robots is often used in the press. This is an image from December 2016, so soon after Trump was elected, and people were wondering what the new US administration's policy would be on whether or not to create and deploy robots that can decide to kill human beings. And I think we're still waiting for the answer to that question, even with the new administration. People worry that AI will replace humans in their economic roles, and predictions there are all over the place. Some economists argue that actually it will create more jobs. Some argue that it will get rid of almost all jobs. We actually don't really know the answer yet, but I would say the arguments on both sides still need quite a bit of work before you could actually believe them. So let's assume that we get past all these, shall we say, temporary problems with the misuse of AI, and that we actually succeed in creating general purpose intelligence. So let's just look at the upside for a minute. We have the possibility that general purpose AI would become a technology that completely revolutionizes the economy of the world, the living standards of people on Earth. So I'm going to try to illustrate that by looking back in history and how something that we now take for granted, namely travel, came to be a service. So TaaS means travel as a service. And it's a service in the sense that, you know, you take your phone out, you go tap, 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 and then you travel across the world. So in 1800, if I wanted to go from, let's say, London to Australia, in present money, it would be on the order of $1 billion. Would probably take you about 10 years, because you'd have to, you know, hire hundreds of people. You'd have to outfit ships. You'd have to consult with navigators. You'd have to collect whatever partial incorrect maps there were. And by the time you'd done all that and then set sail, you have a very good chance of being dead before you get there. So really expensive, really long, really difficult. And now in 2020, you go, or 2021, I should say, you go tap, 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 tap. And as long as they actually let you into Australia, then for a relatively tiny amount of money and relatively tiny amount of time, limited by physics, and you're almost certainly going to be alive when you get there. So imagine if we could take that kind of transformation and apply it to everything, things that are currently expensive. So XaaS means everything as a service. But things that currently are long expensive, like, so NeurIPS is the Neural Information Processing Conference. It's a very big, you know, 15,000 person conference. And it's a huge undertaking. There are hundreds of people involved in organizing this and hundreds more involved in actually delivering it. And there are, you know, whole books, so the organizers are all volunteers, but there are whole books with hundreds of pages of details of how to do all the organization and so on. But in 2035, we might just say, oh, you know, I guess we're having NeurIPS again this year. Can you take care of it? And the machine just does everything, right? It understands what that means. It collects all the information it needs. It makes all the plans. It issues all the orders to other machines, the physical robots who need to do some of the physical work. You know, same if you're, you know, in a remote village and you need a school, you just get out your phone, tap, tap, tap. You know, we need a school. And the cost goes down to really the cost of land and raw materials, things that are not scalable in the same way that information and computation are scalable. But because all the people are out of the supply chain, you don't need the very expensive architects, construction engineers, permit experts, planners, and so on. You can do all these things at almost no cost. Even long, complicated processes like teaching children or training surgeons. Again, these require individual attention, and it's the time of human beings that is expensive. And so all of these things can become available at very little cost. And the kinds of systems, so don't think about you know, a robot that carries its brain with it. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be perhaps even a global AI system with a massive network of computational and data resources that you tap into in much the same way that we tap into the electrical grid, right? We don't all have, you know, a generator in our house producing electricity. We tap into a grid. Same idea with AI. And then there would be physical appendages, right? Physical extensions, some of them with legs because they need to go upstairs, some of them with wings because they need to fly around and take video from up in the air, some of them wheeled so that they can deliver large amounts of goods at high speeds. But those physical extensions are just there to carry out the plans that are made by the grid, if you like. So if you figure out just the economic value of that, so ignoring the fact that general purpose human level or superhuman AI would be able to do lots of new things that we currently can't do, just doing the things that we can do at low cost and delivering them on a global scale would mean that we would raise the GDP of the world. So just giving everyone a standard of living that we already know how to deliver with no extra technology besides the AI would be about a 10-fold increase in GDP to bring everybody up to, let's say 90th percentile in the US income spectrum. So a 10-fold increase in world GDP translates into a $13.5 quadrillion net present value. So that's sort of the cash equivalent of that 10-fold larger income stream. And that's a lot of money, right? That's actually millions of times more than these enormous AI research and development investment plans that the Chinese government and the Europeans and the American government are announcing with enormous fanfare. But those amounts, those $10 billion, $100 billion plans are absolutely minuscule in comparison. And I think it would just change the whole dynamic of the world. Much of the conflict, not all of it, but much of the conflict that has characterized the last few thousand years of human history has been about controlling resources, the access to the wherewithal of life. But with general purpose AI, that conflict becomes completely meaningless. It becomes like fighting over who has more copies of a digital newspaper, right? No one does that because it doesn't make sense to fight over digital copies. And this type of AI is basically a tap that anyone can turn on to access material goods and wealth and education and so on. So although there are going to be, I think, some hiccups along the way, and I'm certainly not claiming that current AI technology can deliver anything equivalent to human intelligence or anything superior to human intelligence. I think it's prudent to assume that eventually the progress will reach its logical conclusion, that the prediction that Turing made, that we would soon leave humans far behind, is going to come true. And the point that Turing is making is that when you create systems that are more intelligent than human beings, if you think about why we have power over the world, right? Why are we in charge of the world and not the Antarctic krill, for example? And there are millions of times more krill than there are humans. But why is it that we have power over the world and they don't? It's because of our intelligence. So we're now creating something that will be more powerful than human beings. And Turing is simply asking, how does a less powerful entity, namely us, retain power forever over something that's more powerful than humans? And Turing's answer was, we don't. And I'm trying to figure out, is there any way that we can actually do this? It's quite a trick if we can do it. So to understand why it is that things go wrong, right? Why is it that making AI better and better and better could lead to an outcome that's arbitrarily bad? So to understand that question, we have to look at the way we have been conceiving of AI all along since the beginning. And I call this a standard model. That's not a name that's in widespread use as it is in physics. You know, they talk about the standard model of physics. But when you look at AI and all these other disciplines, control theory, statistics, operations research, economics, all of them adopt this model, which is that we create machinery that optimizes an exogenously specified objective. So exogenously meaning that the machine doesn't come with an intrinsic objective. It's something that we define ourselves and we plug into the machine, right? And in AI, that objective could be, you know, a goal like take me to the airport. It's sometimes a reward function used in reinforcement learning. Sometimes it's a loss function used in supervised learning and so on. So if you're familiar with any of these fields, you can map the concepts and problem definitions in those fields onto this standard model. And the problem with it, where does it go wrong? The problem is that we cannot specify objectives completely and correctly in the real world. And there are many reasons why we haven't noticed this problem very much in the past. I think the people who have probably noticed it the most are the economists. And they're very familiar with the idea that the objectives that we typically specify and pursue in economics, which might be quarterly profit, it might be GDP for a country, don't actually capture what we really want. And in fact, the pursuit of profit in many accounts is the reason why we're heading towards climate disaster, because profit didn't include all the things that we care about. And same thing goes for GDP. But this is not exactly a new story, right? We have known for thousands of years that we're really terrible at specifying objectives completely and correctly. So this is King Midas. And as you know, he specified the objective that everything he touched should turn to gold. And the gods gave him exactly what he asked for. And then, of course, his family and his water and his food all turn to gold. And he dies in misery and starvation. This is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the Mickey Mouse version. And the apprentice asks the broom to fetch water. In fact, does a magic spell telling the broom to fetch water, but he's not good at specifying the objective, so it doesn't say how much water and when to stop. And then, of course, disaster ensues, and the sorcerer has to come along and fix the problem. But there isn't going to be a sorcerer who comes along and fixes the problem if we get it wrong with artificial intelligence. Another example, is the genie who grants you 3 wishes, and the third wish is always, please undo the first 2 wishes because I've ruined everything. And of course, there may not be a third wish in the real world. And when we look at the present day, we're already seeing this problem coming true. So if you look at what the algorithms do, so the social media content selection algorithms, this is the algorithm that, if you're on YouTube, it's the one that decides what is the next video that you're going to watch. If you're on Facebook, it's the algorithm that decides what gets into the top of your news feed. These algorithms, they're all designed to optimize some fixed objective, and they don't tell you exactly what they are, although you can find out through various publications and various other kinds of releases of information. But to a first approximation, you can think of them as trying to maximize click-through, right? The probability that whatever it is they recommend, that you're actually going to interact with it, click on it, or watch it, or whatever it might be. And you might say, okay, well, that's not so bad, right? Then the algorithms will have to learn what people want, and that's good. But in fact, that isn't how the algorithms operate, because that's fine for maximizing click-through in the short term, right? For the next item that I'm going to send you. But the algorithm's objective is to maximize click-through over the long term. So the long-term sum of clicks, right? The sum of rewards over the future. And to do that, they can do much better by modifying you to be more predictable. Because the more predictable they are, the higher the click-through rate is going to be in future. Because then they can send you the stuff that they know you're going to click on. At least anecdotally, it seems plausible that predictable means extreme in viewpoint, whether it's for political news or for video content or whatever it might be. And I think increasingly there's a realization, even among the social media platforms and other tech giants, that this is what's going on, that optimizing for these fixed objectives has been disastrous because the fixed objective doesn't capture all the things that we care about. Right? We care, we would like people to be well informed, but we don't want them to be misinformed. We don't want them to be addicted to violent pornography, for example, or violent video games. There's all kinds of things beyond just revenue generation that actually matter to human beings. And so this idea that optimizing a fixed objective can have bad outcomes because there's stuff that isn't included in the objective, that leads to the conclusion that the better we make the AI system, the worse the outcome can be, because the more capable AIs, and we have to say, the AI algorithms in social media platforms are extremely simple. Like, they don't even know that human beings exist. As far as they're concerned, you are just a sequence of clicks and nothing more. But if they actually had better models of people's interests and beliefs and interactions and so on, they could be much, much more effective at this manipulation. So the better the AI system, the worse the outcome. The AI is going to be more able to make a mess of everything that is not included in the objective in order to optimize the objective that's given to it. It's also going to be more capable of resisting any attempts to interfere with the optimization of the objective that it's been given. Okay, so now we're in this situation where we've adopted a general methodology that seems to be fundamentally flawed, and if we continue along this road, the side effects are going to be more and more and more serious, and eventually, as Turing said, we're going to lose control. So it's interesting to go back and say, well, why did we go down this route in the first place? And it was a very natural route to go down, because what we did, I think, was to take, at the beginning of AI, right, we got the artificial part, right? That's going to be a machine. But what's the I part? What exactly do we mean by intelligence in an operational form? And the definition that was already well understood in philosophy and economics, the idea of the rational human being, a person who acts, whose actions can be expected to achieve objectives, right? So humans are intelligent to the extent that our actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. And so the natural translation of that to machines is to say that machines are intelligent to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And they don't come, as I said, there are no intrinsic objectives in machines. So we would then plug those objectives in, and off you go. And that's the methodology that I'm arguing is actually flawed, because we can't plug objectives in if we can't explicate them completely and correctly. And there are very limited situations where that's possible. So games are a good example, because the true objective of a game is actually built into the definition of the game. So checkmate is built into the definition of playing chess. But even with a self-driving car, the objective is actually extremely unclear, and the self-driving car companies and research groups, are spending a great deal of time proposing and refining and refining and refining exactly what the objective should be, besides not crashing and getting to the destination. And even those two objectives have to be traded off, because the best way to not crash is to stay in the garage, right? But that doesn't get you to the destination. So you'll have to make a trade-off. And even that trade-off is unclear how it should be made properly. So this methodology doesn't work, but we can slightly revise it to get a methodology that I think does work. So if we say not just intelligent, but actually beneficial is what we want. And in retrospect, that seems kind of obvious, right? Yes, we didn't really mean intelligent machines that are so intelligent they can destroy the world, right? What we really meant was machines that are beneficial to human beings. They're just very good at being beneficial. That's what we want. And a machine is beneficial to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve our objectives. So just changing the possessive pronoun, our objectives there are the ones that matter. And this is going to be a more difficult problem, because now the machine has to choose actions to optimize something that isn't in the machine at all, namely our objectives. These are in us, and it may be very hard to get them out. But it turns out that this is possible. And when you do it right, then you get machines that are actually provably beneficial to humans. So the principles on which we should, I think, base the new model of artificial intelligence. The first one is that the robot's only objective is to satisfy human preferences. And I put an asterisk on preferences because I want to be clear what that means. It doesn't just mean, what kind of pizza do I choose? It means which future do I prefer? And the future here encompasses everything that I could possibly care about. And so we think of preferences meaning my ranking order over all possible futures for the universe, right? Now that's obviously a very hard thing to write down. And that's kind of the point. And that's why we have the second principle. The robot is uncertain about what those human preferences are. And this is the key point, right? This is what actually provides the margin of safety that I think will allow us to stay in control, no matter how powerful the machines become. Because a robot that is uncertain about human preferences, but by the first principle is obligated to satisfy them, is going to behave in all kinds of ways that are deferential to human beings, as I will explain in a minute. And then the third principle basically provides a connection that allows the robot to learn. So it's in some sense, it's a form of grounding of what we mean by human preferences. And the evidence for what human preferences are is to be found in human behavior. So human behavior means everything that human beings do, including verbal behavior like asking for a cup of coffee, right? That's sort of fairly direct evidence of preferences. But it could be just doing nothing, right? So if you're politely sitting here and listening to me, that's evidence about your preferences, right? The fact that you're not leaving. Maybe you have left already and you just left your Zoom on out of politeness. So all human behavior, everything we've ever written, every movie we've ever produced, every novel, every news article, every interaction, all of this is evidence about human preferences. It's all very imperfect evidence in the sense that our behavior doesn't perfectly reflect our true underlying preferences about the future for all kinds of reasons that I'll talk about later. So we can take these principles, we can turn them into a formal mathematical framework that we call an assistance game. So it's a game because there are multiple decision-making entities, at least one human and at least one machine, although there can be arbitrarily many of each. And it's an assistance game because of the way we've set it up. The whole purpose of this is for the machine to be of assistance to the human. So in game theory, they talk about payoffs. What is the payoff function of each of the agents? And the payoff function of the robot is the payoff function of the human. It's just that the robot doesn't know what it is, but it is the payoff of the human, whatever that might be. And when you write down these games and you just solve them, right? You don't script the behavior of the human or you don't script the behavior of the robot. You just write down the mathematical definition of the problem, and then you let the algorithm solve the machine half of this game. You will see that the robot in its behavior will defer to the human. It will ask permission before carrying out an action that might impinge on part of the world where the robot doesn't understand human preferences, right? So, for example, if the robot is supposed to restore carbon dioxide levels and it comes up with a plan that involves turning the oceans into sulfuric acid, and it doesn't know your preferences for what the ocean should be, then it's going to ask permission before doing that because you may have a preference and it does not want to violate that preference. And so it has an incentive to ask permission before doing that. And in the extreme case, right, it will allow itself to be switched off. And I'll go through that example in a minute. So that's good. And roughly speaking, right? The slogan is that with this model, the better the AI, the better the outcome is going to be, because it's going to be better at figuring out what your preferences are, as well as better at satisfying them, coming up with better solutions on your behalf. And to some extent, that's a mathematical theorem, but there's certainly assumptions that are needed to make that true. So let me illustrate, as I said, why it is that a machine is going to allow itself to be switched off. So here's a machine. This is the robot, the PR2 robot in our lab, very big, heavy, expensive robot. And like all such robots, it has to have, by law, an emergency shutoff switch. There it is on the back. And in the old way of doing things, right, in the standard model of AI, right, if we give the robot an objective like fetching the coffee, right, if it's got any brain cells at all, it can figure out that it can't fetch the coffee if it's dead. Namely, if someone switches it off, it won't be able to fetch the coffee. So it will conclude that it ought to disable its off switch to prevent failure in achieving this, this fixed objective of fetching the coffee. So it's not that we built in self-preservation, right? It's self-preservation is a logical consequence of having one of these fixed objectives, because it won't be able to achieve the objective if it's dead. And there might be a whole bunch of other undesirable things that the robot might do because they're not mentioned in the objective. And the other Starbucks customers could certainly delay the fetching of the coffee or even interfere with the fetching of coffee. And therefore, it's perfectly fine to taser them all and make sure that that failure mode doesn't happen. Okay, so this is what we want to avoid, right? This is the kind of thing that happens with incorrectly and incompletely specified objectives. So in the new model, the reasoning of the robot goes quite differently. It says, okay, the human might switch me off, but only if I'm doing something wrong. And because of the first principle, it knows that it doesn't want to do wrong things, right? It wants to satisfy human preferences. By the second principle, it doesn't know what wrong means, right? But the human does, or at least the human has more direct access to their own preferences. So if the human switches the robot off, it's to prevent the robot doing something that the robot doesn't want to do, but doesn't know that what they're about to do is wrong. So therefore, the robot concludes that it should let the human switch it off. In fact, you can turn this into a very simple mathematical theorem by writing down some Greek, and then you get a theorem that this robot is provably beneficial to the human, and that the robot has a positive incentive to allow itself to be switched off as long as it's uncertain about human preferences. As soon as the uncertainty goes away, if the robot believes that it understands human preferences completely, then the incentive to allow itself to be switched off goes away. So this is the core, the kernel of human control over machines, I think, is the ability to switch them off, and it comes from uncertainty. So I'm not going to go into the mathematical derivations of this. There are papers on the web that describe lots and lots of the mathematical foundations of this. But I just want to mention some of the directions for research in the future. We have many, many things to do to make this new model complete and practical and usable, and to allow it to replace the standard model of AI. The two main directions for new research, I think, are, first of all, how do you make decisions on behalf of many humans? So obviously, the many humans can have different preferences, and that's fine. We're not asking the machine to learn one model of human preferences. We're asking it to learn a model for each person, potentially 8 billion models, predicting which future each person prefers and how strongly. But then the problem comes, well, how do you trade off the preferences of multiple individuals? And this is something that moral philosophers have worked on for literally thousands of years. And in the book, I don't propose that there's a solution, but I explore one branch of thinking called preference utilitarianism, which seems to be quite compatible with a lot of the mathematical results in artificial intelligence, and seems to produce sort of the right basic idea, which is that you weigh everyone's preferences equally, and you try to satisfy them to the maximum extent possible. Second large area of research, non-rational humans. So the fact that our underlying preferences are not perfectly reflected in our behavior. So to give you a very simple example of that, right? So Lee Sedol, who was the human Go player that we saw earlier, although he's possibly the best living Go player, he made mistakes. He made moves in his games against AlphaGo that were guaranteed to lose. So if you thought that he was rational, you would have to conclude that he wanted to lose. But that would be a wrong conclusion. The right conclusion is that he wanted to win, but his cognitive limitations caused him to make incorrect moves. So to interpret human behavior, you have to understand our cognitive limitations. And Lee Sedol playing Go is about as rational as humans get, right? In real life, coping with the enormous complexity of the real world, we're nowhere close to being perfectly rational. Not to mention the fact that we do things for emotional reasons, for sometimes one part of our brain takes over and does something that the other part of our brain doesn't like and immediately regrets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that has to be understood. And even I think there's reason to question the fundamental idea that we have stable, coherent preferences about the future. In fact, our preferences about the future are malleable. And that's, I think, an important area for future work, understanding how to act on behalf of someone whose preferences change over time. We also have very practical requirements. So the foundations of AI, every chapter of the AI textbook begins by saying, okay, in what form is the objective specified? And all the chapters assume that there is an objective and it is specified. And in fact, if that assumption goes away, that means we have to rebuild all the technology of AI, the formal frameworks, the definitions, the algorithms, the complexity proofs, et cetera, et cetera. Everything has to be redone. So there's a lot of work there. And then we have to actually demonstrate that when you build AI systems according to this new model, you just get something that is fundamentally better because it avoids a fundamentally false assumption, which is that we can specify objectives completely incorrectly upfront. So to summarize, I think the argument that Turing is making is that if we pursue the standard model of AI, which I think he had in mind in 1951, that leads to a loss of human control, which we cannot afford. But it is possible to define a new kind of AI, a new model for AI that leads to provably beneficial AI systems. And these are actually the kind of AI systems that we want, not the other kind. And I want to get away from this idea that there's an AI community and then there's an AI ethics community that wags its finger at the AI people saying bad, 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 right? What you need instead is that when people think about what constitutes good, high quality AI research, it is this kind of AI research. And if you think about that, right, it's sort of obvious, right? Building AI systems that are not beneficial to humans is not good AI research. And it should be second nature, just like building a bridge that falls down is not good civil engineering, right? And that's the way we want it. That's the only way this is going to work. And if you've been listening, you're probably thinking, oh, well, what about these other important problems, right? What about people who don't want to use beneficial AI, people who want to take over the world, right? We call this the Dr. Evil problem. And that's not so much a technology problem, but it's sort of, well, in the sense that it's more like a cybersecurity problem, right? It's an issue about the security of software, and policing and standards and so on, to make sure that people are not developing the non-beneficial kind of AI to the point where they could threaten human control. And then the other thing you have to be careful about is what I call overuse. So people will naturally, just because of the way we are, people will naturally want the AI to do a little bit more than is really good for us in the long run. And that could lead to a slippery slope into what you might say is enfeeblement of human civilization. And, you know, up to now, right, the reason we have a civilization is that enormous effort, and you can back of the envelope about 1 trillion person years of effort has gone into transmitting our civilization to the next generation. So not, and there's all the stuff about inventing it, but just keeping it going by transmitting it to the next generation of humans is an enormous part of what makes it work. And we've had no choice up to now, because if we stopped doing that, our civilization would collapse within a generation. So we have to do it, and we do it, and we put a lot of effort and time into it. Most of you will end up putting 20 years of your lives into learning, at least. And so if the incentive to do that goes away, if it becomes possible for our civilization to run without the next generation of humans learning how it runs and how to run it, then we lose the incentive for that process to happen at all. And that would be kind of irreversible, and we want to avoid that. But that's, again, not so much a technical problem as more a cultural problem, and we may need the AI systems to help us to actually, you know, as parents tell their children, you know, today I'm not going to tie your shoelaces. You have to do it yourself. And the AI systems are going to have to do that with us humans. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I guess we'll go to questions. I see there's a lot of stuff in the chat.
Hi, so can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry, my video, I can't start it. Polly, can you start my video? Stuart, thanks so much for that. And yes, there are a lot of questions in the chat. By the way, just to follow up on social media, you know, clickbait and whatnot, someone asks, and they just suggest that maybe you would like to watch the new Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. They say that it's quite wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I know some of the people who made it. I haven't watched it yet. I keep trying to get my kids to be interested in watching it, but they won't agree to it. But yeah, I think it gets into some of the problems that are being caused by social media, and also they talk about the kind of mixed motivations within the corporations. You know, I think even though many of these corporations started out being tech-driven and run by techie people, you know, some of whom were somewhat idealistic, as soon as they start being worth lots of money, the money people take over, and then it becomes much more difficult.
So now let me go to some more substantive questions. And Drazia Simon writes, how are or could people be modified to be more predictable?
Well, so the algorithm doesn't care how it does that, right? So let me give you an example of someone who watches video on YouTube. And there are people who do this. They spend several hours a day just, you know, YouTube, you go on YouTube, you watch a video, immediately it recommends another video for you to watch. In fact, it loads it up and will start playing it unless you stop it, right? And so let's say the algorithm just finds that when it sends you a video that's a little bit more violent, so let's say you watch videos of people playing video games, and it just sends you one that's a little bit more violent, a little bit more violent, a little bit more violent, right? It's moving you, it's changing your taste and your preferences. It's moving you towards an extreme. And at that extreme, you're willing to keep watching for hours and hours and hours. Whereas before, right, you wouldn't have. If it sent you the extreme video right away, you would say, oh, this is horrible. I don't want to watch. I'm switching it off. But it desensitizes you, and it's learned how to move you in sort of person space to a different place where you wouldn't have wanted to be, but now you're there. You consume that type of content, whether it's, you know, violent pornography or extreme political content, conspiracy theories, eco-terrorism, you name it, right? It doesn't care. It's just figured out that that's a place that it can move you to by sending you certain series of content. You know, and humans do this as well, right? I mean, I don't think the German people started out in 1932 thinking that mass extermination of Jews was their cup of tea, right? But they were gradually moved and desensitized by Hitler and Goebbels and the propaganda machine to the point where they did think that that was their cup of tea. And, you know, and so the difference here is that with human propaganda in the old style, it was broadcast, right? You had to send the same message out to millions of people, and you couldn't really see how well each person was receiving it and responding to it. But with algorithms, it can tailor the propaganda message to you personally, and it can see exactly how well you're responding to it, and therefore customize it dynamically. And so it seems like it can be very, very effective. Plus, it has more control over your time and your information intake than any dictator in history has ever had.
Okay, so let's turn to more questions. There are so many. Chevis Johnson writes, hello, Stuart. Thank you for doing this talk. In your book, you recommend ensuring that AI systems that interact with humans are provably beneficial before deploying them. For those of us who are already in the business of designing, implementing, or deploying intelligent agents that interact with humans, what do you recommend we be most careful about to avoid the worst negative outcomes for the entire field of AI and for humanity as a whole?
Great question. So what will happen is so imagine that there's a spectrum of, you know, of AI systems that are very, very ignorant about human preferences, and the way they are going to behave is extremely cautiously, right? They're often going to be asking for permission. They're often going to be formulating very cautious plans that only touch the parts of the world that they already know that you're happy to have touched in that way, right? And as they learn more about your preferences, then they'll ask permission less frequently, they'll develop more ambitious plans, and so on. But you'll be happy with their behavior all the way along, right? And so that technological approach, I think, is just a better one than the one we currently assume, which is that you plug the objective in at the beginning and then you hope for the best, right? Because that doesn't produce these cautious behaviors. It doesn't produce asking for permission. It doesn't have any of the fail-safe kinds of characteristics. So I always suggest that, you know, even if you're doing it the old way, and that's probably at the moment you probably don't have any choice if you're, you know, using any existing software, that you think about what are the real objectives that could be affected. So you've got to think about, okay, I'm going to deploy this system. What is the, as it were, the transitive closure of its actions, right? What could it affect if it, you know, from any arbitrary behavior that it can produce, what could it affect? And then try to write down what all the things that you care about for that part. So, you know, if all you're doing is writing a chess program, it doesn't affect very much, right? It affects the positions of the pieces on the virtual chessboard and nothing else. And so it can be annoying to the human who's playing with it because it's taking too long and things like that. But, you know, that program doesn't have the ability to propagandize humans into a genocide or anything like that. But if you're writing algorithms that interact directly with billions of people and determine what they read and watch, then of course the consequences of the actions of that program could include genocide. And so you better be a lot more careful. And I would argue that we probably just shouldn't be deploying those systems at all because we're not ready to design them properly. You know, and you know that we have a long history of not deploying things until we're sure that that they're going to work. That's why we have the FDA and clinical trials for drugs. That's why we have all kinds of safety tests that have to be done before we have a new commercial jet aircraft that's going to carry lots of passengers. And you know, we saw what happened with the 737 MAX when you try to bypass those tests. So there's a lot of reason to say we should actually be pretty cautious. And I would argue, for example, that public-facing algorithms, so the kinds of algorithms that determine what you read and watch, that those ought not to be reinforcement learning algorithms, because it's the reinforcement learning that effectively allows the algorithm to generate these propagandizing paths, right? These sequences of content that lead you to be a different person at the end, the manipulation sequence, if you like. Whereas supervised learning doesn't have that property. It has other drawbacks in terms of the filter bubble, right? That kind of narrows your interest. If it just sends you the stuff that you already like, then your interests get narrower and narrower and you don't become more well-informed. So anyway, there's lots more I could talk about, but those are the core things. And eventually, you know, when we have worked out the technological solutions for how to do this new model for various kinds of AI systems, then I hope those templates will be regulated. That, you know, for that type of system, you'll have to use a template that has these properties.
Stuart, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to think of your model in the context of a radical future where, to go back to the beginning of your talk, you talked about the possibility of a global AI. And, you know, when we think of the future, of course, AI won't just be all around us making clever robots and autonomous vehicles. It will likely be inside the head as well. So in trying to understand how to calculate preferences, human preferences, I mean, how do we avoid getting in a weird loop where the preferences that the machine is actually calculating are just the preferences of humans that are merged with artificial intelligences?
I think that's a good question, and it's not one that I really consider in the book. I do talk briefly about the idea that we might merge with machines, and Elon Musk views this as he views it as one way of not losing the battle to machines, is actually to merge with them, so that we stay one step ahead by just using them directly within our brains. I think the idea that everyone in the human race has to have brain surgery just in order to survive is a bit depressing, and maybe indicates that we made a mistake somewhere along the line. So it would, I think, if we really merge with the machines in the sense that our mental operation is now running on hardware, and that affects the kinds of preferences we have about the future. Yeah, I think that does feel like the potential to go down a path where our preferences change. And I think this is, as I say towards the end of the book, this is the biggest missing piece of the whole story, is the solution that I'm proposing works to the extent that humans have stable preferences about the future. It's not a solution for humans whose preferences are themselves subject to modification by whatever technology we develop. And I suggest that we have to think hard about that, but developing technologies that specifically intended to modify human preferences is a really dangerous direction to go.
I agree. Sadly, I worry that we need to anticipate this in the AI safety community. Now, let me turn to a question by Stephen Hoover. He says, would you be willing to comment on Stuart Armstrong's no free lunch theorem for a subset of inverse reinforcement learning agents?
Sure, yeah. In fact, Stuart just sent me another version of his paper yesterday. So what Stuart's pointing out, and I think there's some validity to it, is that if humans are imperfect decision makers, and this is where I'd really like to have a whiteboard to scribble on, but it's too complicated to set that up, so I won't. But let's start with a case where humans are perfect decision makers. So they have preferences. We can think of that, let's call those preferences theta, right? And then they act. And let's call the process of converting preferences into action, we'll call that pi star, right? So pi star is notation that we use to mean optimal policy in AI. So pi star of theta means take the preferences theta and produce the optimal behavior according to those preferences theta, right? And then the process that the machine has to go through is observing the behavior pi star of theta, right? And then trying to figure out, oh, well, what was theta, right? What are the preferences that this human has if they behave that way, right? And you know, in simple situations, it's kind of obvious, right? So if I give a person a menu, you know, they come into the coffee shop and the menu has tea and coffee and they both the same price and they choose the coffee, then they probably prefer the coffee to the tea. And now I've learned something about their preferences, right? So it's common sense. And then Stuart Armstrong says, well, but what if the human's not perfect, right? If instead of pi star, we have, you know, some other function f, right? And it's an imperfect translation that it produces not optimal behavior, but sort of more typical complicated human behavior. And you don't know what f is. Now you've got to figure out both f and theta, the preferences and the thing that translates preferences into behavior. You've got to figure out both of those. And what he argues is that if both of those are unknown, then there isn't a unique solution that can be recovered by observing just the behavior f of theta. Okay, and so let me give you an example of that, right? So Garry Kasparov, we think of him as his theta is I want to win the game, and his f is not pi star, it's not perfect behavior, but it's pretty close to perfect behavior. So that's how we think of Garry Kasparov, right? A very good chess player who wants to win the game, right? But maybe Garry Kasparov wants to lose the game, but he's extremely bad at losing, right? And he just keeps on winning even though he doesn't want to, right? And because he's really bad at expressing his feelings, he keeps cheering when he wins, even though he wants to lose. And he's he appears to be very, very unhappy, even though he's happy when he does lose, right? So you could basically reversed the polarity on both his preferences and his decision-making algorithm. And you couldn't tell which of those two situations is really the case with Garry Kasparov. Is he a brilliant chess player who wants to win, or is he a suicidal chess player who just can't help winning even though he doesn't want to? Right. Now, so that's the mathematical theorem that Stuart Armstrong is arguing is a fundamental obstacle to this approach. But, you know, do you really think that that's a reasonable argument? And I think the answer is no, because the variety of situations is such that by the appropriate kinds of controlled experiments under some very, very weak assumptions, we can start to recover properties of your decision-making, just as what psychologists do, right? They do these experiments and they figure out, you know, when do people make good decisions? When do they make bad decisions? When, you know, when does one thing interfere with another? You know, one assumption would be that in a situation where the choice is completely obvious, it requires no deliberation, no complicated calculation, right? So think of it as, you know, I stick Kasparov in front of a board where, you know, one move obviously loses and one move immediately wins, right? So, you know, you either give away all your pieces or you checkmate the opponent in one move, right? So you see what he does. And lo and behold, he chooses the checkmate, right? So, and I think it makes no sense to say that that someone has preferences that are never ever reflected in their behavior, right? There is no possible conceivable experimental circumstance where this preference would make any difference to their behavior, right? Well, then I would say, well, then they don't have that preference, or it doesn't make sense to worry about whether they have that preference or not, right? It's sort of like, you know, other alternative universes. Well, maybe there are, but so what? And so I think there's work to do in terms of writing down sort of what we mean minimally for something to qualify as a preference, right? What are minimal conditions for it to have some effect on your behavior? And I think this would be one of them, right? In situations that require no deliberation, right? And this is why when, you know, people do preference elicitation experiments in economics and consumer research, you know, they just give people a choice. They say, look, you know, you can have the strawberry lollipop or the lime flavored lollipop, you know, taste them and tell us which one you like better, right? It would be ridiculous to say that if you consistently say, oh, I really like the strawberry one, nonetheless to insist that in fact you prefer the lime flavored one, right? I mean, but that's what Stuart Armstrong is arguing, that that's a consistent interpretation of the data. And I'd say, no, it's not a consistent interpretation of the data. Sorry, that was a long answer to an interesting question.
But yeah, there's so many interesting questions here. So I'm now, Polly is going to move everybody over to panelists, so we can actually feel like we're talking to a group, Stuart, finally.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna, there's so many awesome questions. Okay, so let's see. Raymond Annenberg writes, will there be a point of superintelligence in an AI agent when it starts to ask itself, why should I pursue a human objective when I can set my own objective? If that happens, then the new model will fail.
So that's an interesting question. And I think it gets to one of the things that the media and Hollywood, I think, are getting wrong about this discussion. So almost invariably in the movies where things go wrong, it's because the AI has become conscious. And there's this idea that once it becomes conscious, now it's somehow sort of free to choose how it's going to behave. And of course, they always just hate humans and want to destroy us. And if you think about this, you know, from the point of view of your laptop, right? Your laptop is running a bunch of C++ code and Java code and JavaScript and so on and so on. So the idea is if I'm typing on my laptop and adding So more C++ code and more C++ code and more C++ code, then at some point it's going to become conscious. Right now, at that point, does the C++ compiler stop working? Right? Does the code suddenly sort of take on magical, non-causal physics? It stops obeying the rules of operation of C++? No, of course not. Right? It will still do what the program is capable of doing. And it might, I'm not saying that it isn't necessarily conscious, I'm saying, but it's still running the program. And my ability to predict what it's going to do hasn't changed, right? Whether or not it's conscious, I can still predict it on the basis of the C++ code. And if I design the C++ code and I have a mathematical theorem saying, for all possible evolutions of this code that are consistent with the code, it will continue to follow this mathematical framework of provably beneficial AI, of pursuing benefit on behalf of humans, then that theorem is valid even if the machine becomes conscious. Right? It doesn't change anything. So it's a question of designing your systems so that they are not free to, in other words, that I'd say free is the wrong word, so that in their normal operation, they can't overwrite the fundamental principles of their normal operation, right? I can write code that does that. I can write code that in its normal operation simply overwrites itself with random stuff completely, right? And it could come out as anything at all, okay? It's a really bad idea to write code that way. Most of the time it would just stop working altogether, but it might turn into something that takes over the world, and just don't do that. Bad idea. So genetic programming as a way of creating superintelligence is a really terrible idea, because we have absolutely no idea what it would end up as.
Interesting. Lucy Sukolova, whose name I just massacred, writes, I wanted to ask, what happens if the majority of humans' preferences are objectively wrong? For example, discrimination or oppression of minorities.
So those kinds of preferences, right? I mean, presumably, this question comes up in lots of ways, right? Well, what if one person wants to kill somebody else? Well, the person on the receiving end of the bullet also has preferences, including not being dead, right? And so just because one person wants to shoot you doesn't mean the AI is obliged to help that person shoot the other person. In fact, almost certainly the AI will do the opposite. It will prevent the person from shooting the other person. And so behaviors that are based on racial animus, for example, would never be supported because the preferences of the persons on the receiving end would far outweigh the pleasure that people get from exercising their racial animus. But there is one case, I think, where you do want to pay attention, and that's where the preferences are purely sadistic. And so sadistic, it has its usual meaning, but its more general meaning is that my well-being is derived from your loss of well-being, right? Not from anything else, right? So me stealing from you, it doesn't count as sadistic because, I presumably get the benefit of the money or the food that I stole, and I'm just indifferent to your suffering, right? So indifference to your suffering, that's not sadistic. What I mean is that I inflict suffering on you solely for the purpose of inflicting suffering on you, right? Because I derive benefit from that. And I think, in modern utilitarian theory and preference utilitarianism as espoused by various people, that's treated as a special case, right? That we zero out these sort of negative altruism terms in the global preference function.
Thank you. And then
Thank you.
Pablo Khan asks, is there a platform where we can follow your thoughts regarding AI? I'm really enjoying reading Human Compatible, by the way. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Pablo. That's very kind of you. I mean, in the sense of, do I have a blog or a Twitter feed? I don't. No, I am a technophobe. I have an iPhone 5 and I only have that because my wife insists that I carry it so she can bug me about stuff. I could be persuaded, and our center, the Center for Human Compatible AI, is starting a blog. And so I think I'll put pieces there from time to time, and my students will put pieces there. But no, I don't have a stream of consciousness, I'm afraid, sorry.
Because once you start on social media, you won't get anything done, Stuart. Are you writing another book right now, or?
No, I did the 4th edition of the textbook after I finished Human Compatible, and now I'm in recovery.
Yeah, congratulations. Let's see, boy, there's so many questions here. Morgan Rogers writes, doesn't the statement that, quote, the machine's payoff matrix is the same as humans, unquote, suggests that you're just confusing the original problem? You still need a way to determine how the machine is rewarded for satisfying humans, which is comparable to the problem of specifying what humans want.
Yeah, it might seem that way, but in fact, it doesn't work out that way, right? So we're treating the human payoff as a latent variable, right? A hidden variable that isn't directly observed by the machine. But there are many, many situations where that kind of thing doesn't result in, a complete inability to do anything. So let me give you one example, right? Suppose that the machine knows absolutely nothing about human preferences. So what statisticians call an uninformative prior, right? You could think of this like, so uninformative prior would be like, uniform distribution over all possible real numbers, right? So the machine knows nothing, right? You could be a chocoholic, you could be an alien, you could be anything at all, right? How could a machine who knows nothing about humans be useful to humans? So here's one way. If it can find an action which enlarges the set of actions that are feasible by the human, then it can calculate that that will be beneficial to the human, even though it doesn't know what your preferences are. Right? So to give you an example, right? Suppose I've forgotten my password and the machine can tell me my password. Then by telling me my password, it then makes it possible for me to do all kinds of actions that I couldn't do before. And even though it doesn't know what I'm going to do, it knows that I will probably choose things to do that are beneficial to me, and therefore it's beneficial for it to give me the password, right? And so that's one case where even though it might seem that this setup where the machine payoff is the same as the human payoff, seems sort of like to get you into an infinite loop. It doesn't get you an infinite loop. There are many, many, many situations where even in the presence of enormous ignorance about the human payoff function, the machine is still useful to the human. But as I pointed out, the solutions that the machine comes up with depend on how much it knows, right? And when it knows very little, then it will have to be very cautious. And it's actually worth understanding in more detail. Why is it going to be cautious, right? So another way of asking this question is, why do we think a machine that does nothing is a reasonably safe bet, right? What's special about nothing, right? Why, as opposed to choosing an action randomly, right? Why is nothing better than a randomly chosen action? Where does that come from, right? And the answer is actually because the world is already mostly the way we like it, right? The world is not in a random primordial state. The world is in a state that has resulted from the action of rational or quasi-rational human beings operating on it for thousands of years. And so if you take a random action, you're likely to move it to a state further away from human preferences. whereas so doing nothing is probably better than a random action, right? And this, again, you can formulate this mathematically, and you can use, you can look at the state of the world, and from the state of the world, you can infer something about the preferences of the agents who have been operating in it, right? So without actually seeing any human actions, right, just the fact that the world is the way we have made it contains information about our preferences. So if you know anything about the naturalistic fallacy, this is the non-naturalistic non-fallacy, right?
So, Stuart, we're almost getting to 3:30, and I wanted to just kind of touch base on where you see things headed in the future with respect to employment, because, you sketched at the beginning of your talk a very realistic situation in which AI gets better in competence to the point where it can do a lot of human tasks. So what do you see as the future of work, and what can we do now to make sure that humans flourish in the age of AI?
That's a great question, and it's going to have to be the last one because I have another meeting at hour. So, in brief, there's a big debate. But when you ask the economists who think that, oh, there'll just be new jobs, just like there always were, if you ask them, okay, so they're not going to be physical and they're not going to be mental, what are they? The economists sort of like shrug, their mouth drops open, and they so it's quite hard to figure out. And I've been running a series of workshops with economists and science fiction writers, trying to get them to come up with any positive future scenario where AI can do most of the stuff we currently call work. And it's been very difficult because, the default scenario is that we have nothing to do, that wealth is enormously concentrated in the owners of the technology, and the vast majority of humans are unemployable because the skills that we've given them don't allow them to compete with machines that can do it better and cheaper. And that's been going on for a while, but we've actually been moving more and more into mental jobs, which up until now machines couldn't do. And those mental jobs provide a lot of value to each other to the extent that we're good at them. So the mental jobs like, financial advisor, for example, and we have business schools and so on that train people to be financial advisors, and they do something useful, right? But so when you think forward, right, what are we likely to have any kind of competitive advantage in? It's probably not going to be financial advising, right? But it could well be sort of emotional advising. And the competitive advantage we have is that as human beings, we know what things are like, right? I know what it's like when I hit my thumb with a hammer. And therefore, I know what it's like when you hit your thumb with a hammer. And the machine will never know what it's like to hit a thumb with a hammer, right? Because it can't try it out for itself. And even if it did, it wouldn't sort of work the same way. We know what it's like to be dumped by someone you love. We know what it's like to win a prize. We know all kinds of things of what it's like. And so my guess is the future will be interpersonal services, mostly one-to-one or one-to-a-few, and sort of generally services that improve our quality of life, that teach us, inspire us, guide us, accompany us, but for that to be a worthwhile activity with high economic value and status and all the rest, we have to have a science base, right? Right now, babysitting is one of the most important things that people do and one of the least well paid.
Right.
Why? Why is it that we pay 1,000 times as much to a surgeon who fixes our broken leg compared to a babysitter who looks after our children, which are at least as important as our legs? is because the surgeon knows how to do it and the babysitter doesn't, right? The babysitter, you know, they have more or less random effects on our children. So and the reason is we haven't done the science. We don't know how one person can have a good or bad effect on another. And we have to do all that science, and then we have to train people, change our education system completely, change our whole system of qualifications and professions. And this all takes decades and decades. So that's my sense of how things are going to work.
Well, Stuart, I know you're busy and we really appreciate your time today. This video will be posted at the center website. And we're very grateful. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming today.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.